Alright guys, we're going to go ahead and continue our section on Hinduism. At this point you should have a pretty decent understanding of the brief history that kind of led to the group that we call Hindus, this bringing together of the Harappan civilization, or the Dravidians, with this other group, the Aryans, and how the Aryans brought in this caste system and began to write these texts called the Vedas. We have not covered the Vedas in any detail yet. We will do that later on. But you should know that, geographically and historically, where Hinduism evolves. Also, you should have a much better understanding of some key terminology and how they all fit together in this puzzle that is Hindu philosophy or Hindu cosmology. You should understand Brahman, Atman, Samsara. We should understand Maya, Karma, and then also this idea of moksha, of release or liberation from this cycle of samsara. For now, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about the 4 stages of life that a typical Hindu ought to hope to go through, and then we'll also talk about some other things as well. But let's start with these 4 ashramas, or these 4 stages of life. We'll start with the celibate student phase, move into this phase or stage of life called the householder. Then we'll talk about these last, these last 2 stages, the forest dweller and the wandering renouncer. You should know off the bat, the first 2 stages are much more common. The last 2 stages, not all Hindus really try to achieve. Most Hindus will remain within this householder stage. But let's go through these. Also, yes, we should also note that in practice, not necessarily in theory, but in practice, it's much more of a male-centered tradition. That is, we're working with a historically patriarchal, somewhat, unfortunately, misogynistic society that has basically focused on the male's trajectory through these stages of life. So that's not to say that women do not partake in these stages of life and also have this same or similar trajectory. As we get more progressive, as modernization affects many Hindu societies, we see pushes to incorporate women, to represent women at a more equal standing to men. However, historically, that just has not been the case. We see this in other traditions. We saw it in Judaism, we see it in Christianity, we see it in Islam. The more rural, the more traditional, the further back we go in history, the more male-centered these traditions tend to be. On the other hand, we're also going to see that Hinduism exalts the female in many ways as well. Many of the goddesses are strong women that continue to give more purpose and fuel for the fire that is equal rights today when it comes to gender lines. So let's begin with these, the first stage, the celibate student stage. Typically, we're talking about between the ages of 8 or 12 to 24. This is kind of the stage in which you learn, you study, but not just studying your, math and language and history and all of these things like we do in school, but this sacred study, the study of the Vedas, these sacred ancient texts that we'll talk about again in a little bit here. This stage tends to be reserved for the higher castes, those who have the means to send their children to schools to study with those who are well learned in the Vedas. The Vedas are an ancient form of Sanskrit that is difficult for many to be able to read. It's not a language that is spoken throughout India today. Hindi is not the same as Sanskrit by any means, related but not the same. So this would be reserved for the higher caste, where it's believed that the children are born into this caste system because of the spiritual maturity. So there's this kind of self-referential understanding that, hey, because we were born into the Brahmin caste, or the second Kshatriya caste, which we'll talk about, this means that we're fit to study. We're spiritually evolved enough to study. You would also study the Upanishads. You would study with a guru. We'll talk about what these 2 things are as well. And you would learn these disciplines of meditation, of yoga, of contemplation, so on and so forth. The second stage, and the stage in which most Hindus will remain within for their entire lives is this householder stage. So there's this social pressure to be married by the age of 25. So there are certain marriage and family expectations. And again, in each of these stages, you have specific duties attached. So in that first celibate student stage, your duty is to study. Your duty is to learn. This is what is expected of you at this stage. In this stage, your duties shift. So your duties are no longer geared toward focused study, intense study, but rather to provide for one's family, to respect this institution of marriage, to not cause harm or injury to other people. You would support your parents, who are probably elderly, and you would also support holy men in your community, people who have taken this final vow of a sannyasin or a renouncer. And your duty is also to work, to provide for your family in this sense. Women also have these duties, but often what we see in more traditional Hindu societies or families, women's roles are to complement the duties of the man. And then last, there's this notion of kama and artha. Kama referring to desire, and artha referring to wealth or success. So this might seem a little strange because we just talked about how moksha, to achieve moksha, one must rid oneself of all of his attachments or her attachments, all of his or her desires, to become this stoic-like ascetic, a renouncer, someone who does not need attachment, doesn't have these desires anymore. This is the ultimate goal in Hinduism. However, in this second stage, there's an emphasis on the exact opposite. To indulge. Kama, maybe you've heard of the Kama Sutra, this idea that one doesn't just indulge in sensual pleasure, fully indulge in sensual pleasure. There are texts that show you how to do this better, to increase sensuality and eroticism. So the idea here is you go through this stage, the second stage of life, in order to understand what you're giving up. That these pleasures, whether it be sensual or attached to wealth and power and success, that these are fleeting pleasures. These pleasures will go away eventually. You'll come to lose these pleasures at some point. So yes, have great, wonderful sex. Make money. Do all of these things. These are your duties as a householder. However, the idea would be that you would finally progress beyond these experiences. You would eventually see that this is a more shallow understanding of experience or of reality. Think almost like the Rumspringa in the Amish tradition, this idea that one leaves his or her community and engages in the secular world. They drink, they have sex, they do drugs, they party, all of these things. The idea is go out there, see what that world is like. We know eventually you'll come back and we have a greater sense of what is important or what is necessary in this life. This third stage is called the forest dweller stage. The idea here is once you've gone through this family householder stage, you would begin to attempt to give up these earthly possessions. You've indulged in kama and artha. You've indulged in pleasure, desires, and wealth. Now, see if you can give them up. Leave these things with your family. Make sure your family's taken care of. Make sure it's a stable situation. And then see if you can actually live in the world without these possessions. See if you can break these attachments. Push back against these desires that you have once indulged so heavily in. And the idea here is you would, in some sense, literally dwell in the forest. To be in the forest in deeper contemplation. The idea here is try to understand the nature of Brahman without these possessions, without these attachments, without these desires. You go back to this studying of the sacred writings, of these teachings. So moksha would be the complete cutting of these social bonds, these attachments, these desires. We could think of this forest dwelling stage as loosening the social bonds. Begin to take that first step. You have a duty to try to push beyond indulging in the more surface level pleasures of this world, the veneer of Maya, this illusory world that we live in. Try to push beyond that. Try to loosen these bonds, these attachments that have taken such a grip on us. We should note very few men and women take this step. It's easy to kind of settle in to one's attachments and desires. Those who do take it often treat this as a type of retirement. So one is done with work, one is provided for his or her family. And then there's this idea that let's take this step, see if we can begin to understand the nature of Brahman a little more seriously. So your duty is not to just relax in retirement, your duty is to begin to understand the stages that you would have to go through to achieve enlightenment, or moksha. And then that fourth and final stage is the stage of the wandering renouncer, what we call a sannyasin or a sadhu. A sannyasin or a sadhu is someone who's taken this vow of renunciation, moved beyond that forest-dwelling stage, and has completely cut those social bonds, has no desires anymore, has no attachments, has no wants or regrets. He or she is in this settled state of contentment. That is, Atman has become Brahman. That soul is now detached from all of your desires, of its illusory perceptions of the world and the self, and instead is fully Brahman. Remember, and I've said this a couple times, each phase in life, as a celibate student, as a householder, as a forest dweller, and then as a wandering renouncer, they have their own dharma. You have duties assigned to each stage in life. This final stage is open to both men and women, but we see many more men taking this final step than we do women. If a male wandering renouncer is called a sannyasin or a sadhu, the female sadhu would be called a sadhvi. Like I said at the outset of this lecture, the first two stages are taken by the majority of Hindus, right? The celibate student and householder. And even less so the celibate student, because this is really reserved for those who have the means to send one's child or children to study intensely the Vedas and the Upanishads. That householder stage is where most Hindus will settle into, and then these last two are much more rare, especially given the advances of globalization, modernization, secularization, industrial development. All of these things begin to affect the way in which modern Hindus see these stages of life. This would just be a picture I found of a sadhvi, of a female sannyasin, someone who's taken this final vow of renunciation. Okay, now we're going to talk quickly about the caste system. We've talked about it a little bit, so my guess is you have some general idea of what the caste system is. It's also called the Varna system, which refers to color, not the color of skin, not a racial or ethnic understanding of color, but rather the colors one is associated with, that one wears, the colors of his or her clothing. The chief concern with the caste system, the primary concern, is how society is organized. The idea here is one is born into a caste. One doesn't choose a caste. One doesn't go into school and achieve a certain level and then is directed into caste 1, 2, 3, or 4, but rather one is born into it. So it's determined by your birth. And I have here in parentheses, this alludes to a cycle of injustice, or it causes a cycle of injustice. The idea being, oh, if you're born into the lower caste, you probably deserve to be there. It was determined by your previous lives, or the lack of karma, the lack of good action that one performed. So we can also think of the caste system as a class system, because it very much maps onto wealth pretty cleanly, unfortunately. The caste system has historical roots. I hope you remember when we talked about the Aryan migration into the Indus Valley around 1500 BCE. They brought with them this caste system. At the time, they had a 3-level caste system. They had these priestly beings or group at the top that would perform sacrifices in order to maintain the order of the world. Then you had your warriors and kings level that would do the fighting, the conquering. And then you would have the lowest at the time, the laborers, the farmers, the ones who produced and built this society. When they invaded the Indus Valley, the Dravidians, the Harappan civilization that was already there, they became this lower 4th caste. So that's the historical roots. There are also cosmic or mythological roots. So in one of these Vedas, we're going to talk about the Vedas again, in the Rig Veda, the most popular one, the most well-read one today, there's a poem describing this cosmic man who's the origin of the entire universe. It's meant to be very symbolic. The cosmic man created the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, people as well. And from this poem, we see that humans originated in a hierarchical structure. So at the top, there are the purest humans, at the bottom, the most polluted. And we get this story in the Rig Veda. And I'm paraphrasing here in this, what I've written down here, but from his mouth emerged the priests, or what we call the Brahmins. From his arms, so you understand, from the mouth, the Brahmins, those who are intellectual, who speak, who can read, who the mouth is thought to be kind of associated with the intellectual capacity, or the head at least. From his arms, the warriors and kings, so those who fight with his or her arms. The warriors and kings are known as the Kshatriya caste. From his thighs, the commoners, merchants, and farmers, so those who work with their legs, who work with their body. And then from his feet, the servants, the Sudras. So it works, obviously, in one's body from top to bottom. That also has this sense of purity at the top, where our head is. We're the most pure, the most intellectual. Our feet touch the ground. They're dirty. They're the most polluted. And then, like I said before, this correlates heavily to social status, to power, and to wealth as well. So one is born into the lower class. They're born into an impoverished community, most likely. They have no power or very little power in one's society or even local community. And they're seen differently. They have a lower social status. So the first caste would be the Brahmins, this high caste, who are known as the priests. This would be the highest caste. Their Varna, their color associated with them, is white. Again, this is not a racial designation. This is talking about the clothing that they adorn, the clothing and colors that they're associated with. White is understood to be the most pure. Therefore, the priests often wear white. We also see orange as well. We talked about the origin in Aryan Vedic ritual that we talked about it briefly, but early there were this focus on sacrifice, on making offerings through fire, and the priests would do this because this was thought to be sustaining the natural order of the world. We give offerings to retain this natural order. So this is why there are different duties assigned to each caste. is to maintain this order that is natural in the world. The Brahmins are the most intellectual, or thought to be at least the most intellectual. They're the most educated for sure. They're the spiritual leaders of the community. They know the sacred scriptures. They've read the sacred scriptures. They interpret the sacred scriptures. These are the equivalent of your priestly people in many religious traditions. They conduct these rituals. They lead meditations. They also have become the philosophers and teachers of the new waves of students that come through. So highly respected, highly intellectual, and are thought to kind of be in charge of maintaining this natural order in the world. The second caste is called the Kshatriya caste. You could just, the K would be silent in the beginning. These are the kings and warriors and politicians, the ones who rule and fight and conquer. The color associated with them is red. Think passion, energy. So often when you see paintings with people adorned in red, we can think these are the warriors or kings of Hindu society. They're second to the Brahmins, and they lead a different sector of society, right? The Brahmins are in charge of the spiritual sector, this association with the gods or the deities, appeasing the natural order in the world. The Kshatriya tribe is in charge of the secular society, of setting up cities, of ruling people, of the finances and politics of the community. So they often work closely with Brahmins, so they do have much power, and sometimes they're seen on equal footing, just reigning over different segments of society. Their main duty, the dharma of the Kshatriya, is first and foremost to protect society. So this can be interpreted many ways. What does it mean to protect? In some senses, to fight. In other senses, to set up systems of justice and social welfare and these types of things as well. The last two are going to be the Vaishya, which would be the merchants, the farmers, the commoners. The color associated with them is yellow. Think kind of creating from the earth comes this kind of yellow tone. Skilled working class, these are the ones who produce things in society. And then the last would be the Sudras or Shudras. Their color associated with them would be black. It's the color of darkness. It's the most polluted. These would be unskilled laborers, the most poor of any society, traditionally the lowest caste, and not even permitted to study the Vedas. If you come from this caste, you probably, at least historically, it's changing now, but couldn't read, so you wouldn't have any access to the Vedas anyway, but they're not even permitted to do so. You're too polluted to deal with such pure texts that you would not be allowed to partake in studying of the Vedas. Unfortunately, there's emerged even a lower caste, a fifth caste, which is called the Dalit, or the oppressed. They've traditionally been called the untouchables. The idea here is you're so impure that one cannot even touch you, that your poverty has become basically so rampant in society that they had to create this fifth caste, that there are people even below the unskilled laborers, and they would be considered the untouchables. But this word, the Dalit, is now used more often, which refers to them being the oppressed group. This is actually what Mahatma Gandhi named these people. He looked at them and said, no, they're not the untouchables, they're the oppressed. Society has been oppressing them. So they're not part of this traditional Varna system, this traditional four-level caste system, but there emerged a group that society thought was so polluted that a fifth caste was needed. These would be the most socially, politically, and religiously excluded from society. Again, the caste system, this is something that we should not support, right? The caste system is this cycle of violence that continues to affect the poorest, most marginalized people of Hindu societies throughout the South Asian world. So most likely the caste system was created by those who had power, who had privilege, and it's definitely perpetuated by those who have power and privilege. Those who tend to have power and money and wealth, they want to remain in that position. They want to justify this position, and so they justify it through this idea of karma. If you're poor, if you're marginalized, if you're of the lower caste, you probably deserve to be there. Most of us in our class probably don't think this is true, so we see the inherent violence or oppression involved in continuing something like the caste system. Thankfully, in the 20th century, 21st century especially, we see a lot of pushback against traditional understandings of the caste system. So a visual representation of this might look like this. So we have the Brahmins at the top, the Kshatriya second, Vaishya third, and then the Shudras, this is the Varna caste system, the traditional caste system, and then finally at the bottom we have this group, the untouchables, or the Dalit. As we see here, we have the top three are described as twice born. So all of them are first born. There's a once born group for all of these, which would refer to the physical birth. So these are all people who were born in the world. To be twice born is to be able to pursue that second birth, the spiritual birth, which means these top three castes are allowed to pursue these spiritual paths, while the bottom two are not seen as pure enough to be able to pursue spiritual endeavors. Now I was going to talk about the Jati system as well. There's the caste system, which we just talked about, these four groups. Within the caste system, there's the Jati system, which is basically a subcategorization of the caste. I just don't have time, so we're not going to go through all this. If you want to read this, feel free to, but the idea is that within each caste, there is another hierarchy, another system of stratification where often one can only reposition himself or herself higher within his or her caste through marriage, through endogamy, but again, we're not going to get through into any detail when it comes to that. Now we'll talk about the four aims of life, the Purusharthas, which is essentially, we talked about these, all four of them, but this kind of wraps it up a little more tightly. In one's life, you have four aims. First and foremost, your duty. You have your duty depending on your caste, your gender, your place, within your stage of life. All of these basically create your duty at any given point. Then there's the other purpose, which is kama, which is to understand desire, to indulge in desire to a certain degree. Artha, which is success, and then moksha, that final purpose in life, the highest purpose in life, would be liberation, understanding of the true nature of Brahman, and then liberation from this wheel of samsara. It's not that all of these must be achieved in one life, but in human existence in general. So this might take you many lifetimes. Maybe your dharma would be throughout every lifetime, but that might change depending on where you're born into, what caste, what stage of life, so on and so forth. Many are stuck in the kama and artha purposes of life, which is the desire and success. Eventually the goal would be to liberate oneself from these desires, from these attachments. These just mark the ways in which your life should be oriented, and it accounts for all human experience. So it's not denying the fact that people do have desires and attachments and try to seek wealth. This is a realization that this is a natural human experience. So these four Purusharthas are basically trying to demonstrate that this is everything that happens in life, but eventually one should seek liberation, because the number 2 and 3, these are illusory. These are part of Maya, part of this illusory world. I'm going to burn through this kind of quickly because we've talked about all of these, but if you want a little more detail on any of them, you can pause it on any one of these slides, and feel free to ask me questions later. But again, dharma is your sacred duty. This might involve your certain ritual laws that you must partake in. It's determined most likely by your social caste or obligation. Every person has to uphold his or her duty because there's a natural order in the world. There's a natural way the world was created, and it's our duty to act in accordance with it, to try to preserve this natural order. One must continue to obliged to his or her duty. And then, like I said before, one's dharma depends on the caste, the stage in life, and probably your gender. It's derived from multiple sources, but mostly from these sacred texts, the Vedas, the Upanishads, and also the Bhagavad Gita. We're going to talk about the Bhagavad Gita. This is really the source that most modern Hindus will look at, is they'll read the Bhagavad Gita, the story within another text, which we'll talk about as well, that seem to be concerned with the social ordering of society and what one's duties actually are depending on where you fit in that social hierarchy. One example of this would be this notion of ahimsa, or vegetarianism, the idea that the entire world is interconnected. This is going to come through in Buddhism. It would also come through in Jainism, which we're not talking about this semester, unfortunately. But this idea that because we're all interconnected, because our soul can descend down into the animal kingdom through the insects as well, all the way up through the human form and the deity forms as well, that one ought to engage in the idea of ahimsa, which is non-violence. You shouldn't cause harm to others. We all have this Atman, this soul. We're all part of Brahman, so we shouldn't injure others. And then vegetarianism is a result of this idea of interconnectedness as well. Now we also have this idea of kama, desire, and artha, material success. As you can see in the picture in the background, this is not something that throughout Hindu history one shies away from, right? I mean, we see like a mass orgy here in stone form. We see it in the Kama Sutra, in these texts that are illustrated as well. That this is a part of human experience, that we indulge in this experience as well. These would be the duties of the householder, right? To indulge in desire, to try to attain or acquire material success. I talked about kama. I'm just kind of repeating it here. Fully indulge in the sensual joys of human experience, whether that's sexual. I talked mostly about sex because I think probably you guys connect to that the most. But also literary, marital, parental, these joys that come in life. Indulge in them. There's, like I said, text to guide you through this, to make sure you can indulge to the fullest. So we have the Natva Sastras, which are basically showing how can you better experience and find joy in things like literature, music, theater. And then there's the Kama Sutra, which you guys may be aware of, which guide you to more fully experience the sexual pleasures in life. And then artha, this material success, try to become prosperous, try to increase your wealth, to have a successful career in order to ensure security for your family. So a house and food and going on vacations and things like this. These are the joys in life. Now, eventually you're going to see that these joys are superficial, that these are part of the illusory world, and that Brahman is the ultimate goal. But one cannot understand what it means to give up these illusory joys without experiencing them first. So within the Hindu cosmology, there's this push to experience the joys of life. Here's an ancient kind of portion of the Kama Sutra. We can see it's actually illustrated as well. These get much more extensive, obviously. And then there's that fourth aim, that final aim, which is moksha, which is becoming that drop of water fully engulfed in the ocean of water that is existence, that is ultimate reality, or Brahman. So moksha would be release or liberation from that cycle of samsara. Remember, samsara is that cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth. And that samsara is a bad thing. That means you continue to come back, and though you might be able to indulge in some of the joys and sensualities of this world, in the end, you experience suffering and pain, and that you lose these things in time. That wealth doesn't bring you real joy. That sex doesn't bring you closer to what ultimate reality really is, but rather moksha would do that. So it might seem contradictory to artha and kama, right? Asceticism versus indulgence, to be a renunciate or to be fully indulgent. But the idea is these four aims all taken together. So your duty or dharma, artha, kama, and then moksha represent the tension between the life of that worldly person that we all know, that we all are fully probably engulfed in, and the life of the renouncer. So Hinduism is trying to take a broader picture that this is the experience of the world, that all human experiences are valid, they should be experienced, and that Dharma shifts with each portion of life. So Maya, this illusory world, it's not evil, it's not bad. So to indulge in sensual sexual experiences, to love things like literature and theater, to acquire wealth, this isn't a sign of evil. It's just a sign of you're still wrapped up in the illusory world, and the idea is we must push back against this.